Hello, friends. This is the AlphaList podcast. I am your host, Toby. The goal of the AlphaList podcast is to empower CTOs with the info and insight they need to make the best decisions for their company. We do this by hosting top thought leaders and picking their brains for insights into technical leadership and tech trends. If you believe in the power of accumulated knowledge to accelerate growth, make sure to subscribe to this podcast. Plus, if you're an experienced CTO, you will love the discussion happening in our Slack space where over 600 CTOs are sharing insights, or visit one of our events. Just go to alphalist.com to apply. Welcome to the AlphaList podcast. I am your host, Toby, and today I'm talking to David Linthicum, who is the Chief Cloud Strategy Officer at Deloitte, which is a huge company. I just heard, like 165,000 people, right, David?
Yeah, big firm.
But besides that, you have quite a career, and maybe you can pitch yourself a little. You wrote 15 books, you published 7,000 articles. You wrote a book called An Insider's Guide to Cloud Computing. So I think you know the game. So maybe you can pitch yourself a little.
Yeah, well, I'm a cloud SME. I've been involved in the cloud one way or the other for the last 20 years, either as a CTO or a professional service provider. Did the entrepreneurial, I did the CTO thing for a while. I did the big company thing, was a developer for a while. Then did the CTO thing for a while. I was CTO of a lot of smaller publicly traded companies, and I normally worked for them until we had an exit or sold them. Did that about 4 times. Then did the entrepreneurial thing, started my own company and worked for startups and brought those to an exit, and including Cloud Technology Partners, which was the last company I was working for. And I pivoted right out of there into Deloitte. So I'm focused on helping people with cloud computing and, taking the mystery out of what cloud computing is and how to leverage it successfully. My book, Insider's Guide to Cloud Computing, which will be out in a few months, really kind of focuses on that. In other words, it's looking at people, the poor people who have to make this stuff work, and trying to make it work in a very cost efficient way. And something that's what I focus on. I focus on optimization of technology to return value back to the business. I do chase technology in terms of what's cool and what is, and I write and speak about that as a pundit. But I'm just fascinated with leveraging technology in a way that's going to bring most value, profits, revenue back to the businesses that employs them. In this case, cloud computing, but also focus on AI and edge computing and cybersecurity as well.
So you know the game. Happy to hear your insider's guide today. So let's see what the cloud has to offer in the year 23. Quite happy to hear your perspective. So stepping back a little, so you basically did everything, and then you realized, okay, as I did everything, I can now consult. Or why did you end up at Deloitte?
Ended up I started a professional service firm when I was kind of locked out of the product company. When you sell a company, they have certain lockouts. You have to stay away from that particular industry for a certain amount of time. So I went into started my own firm after that, and ended up selling that in 2010, and just continued on with that theme into Cloud Technology Partners. I like both sides of the game. Professional services is a bit more fun to me because it's always changing. People who work for big consulting firms like Deloitte and Accenture and PricewaterhouseCoopers, every day is different. You're always pushing the edge on solving problems, and you learn more in a very short period of time. So that seems to be, versus just focusing on a particular technology sector and a particular product. This is what you do as a CTO. So really enjoy doing that, and I enjoy helping people both within the firm and outside the firm and explaining technology. I'm kind of a passionate educator. I have a bunch of LinkedIn learning courses out there. I teach at LSU, Louisiana State University in the States. So I just like turning people's eyes on to what the technology can do and how to leverage it properly. Professional services seem to be the best area for me to focus on if I want to do that.
Okay. To me,
like when I hear about like professional services and cloud, I always think of lift and shift migrations. I hope you can do more than that these days, working for Deloitte.
Yeah, it's not always lift and shift, and has to be, again, getting to an optimized architecture, and that in some instances is going to be refactoring and changing applications so they're able to take advantage of cloud-based systems. In fact, ultimately, this is about bringing that to light. When enterprises look at migrating to cloud, we saw this during the pandemic, they want to move as quickly and as cheaply as they can to get to what everybody kind of thought was going to be a safe space in the cloud. However, you have to look at what augmentations and how to localize those systems, make them native for the particular environment you're moving into, or else there's going to be cost inefficiencies, not going to work as well. And so lifting and shifting, not always a bad idea, but it typically is something where you're going to have to do some augmentation of the data and the workload as you move it into the cloud. And certainly if you're going to cloud native technology and containers, there's major surgery has to happen. But again, it's looking at the workload, what it does for the business, and then making the assessment as to what changes need to be made as you move it into a public cloud provider.
Okay, before we continue there, I'd like to step back a little to your very early career, or like let's say even before my career, which was most likely before I was born. Like, why are you in computing? What sparked your attention first? Like, why did you choose that career path?
Yeah, when I was a kid, I was a hobbyist. I am old, so I've had a long career. But the thing is, I used to put together Heath kits, and that was computers and Timex Sinclair computers, which came together as kits. Always asked for them for Christmas. So it was putting the hardware together and understanding the basic systems, and then it got into programming. And typically back then, that was an assembler running CPM-based systems, things like that. So 11, 12 years old, putting together computers. 13, started to get into programming, joined the computer club at the high school, which was just first year I think it started. And then when I got to college, I was able to focus more on it and learn more of a formal education around system analysis and design and programming and how that stuff worked. And also took some business courses as well. And it was just, to me, just fascinating that we could do these amazing things with these devices that I viewed as, uber helpful. One of the quotes from Isaac Asimov, who's one of my favorite authors, he wrote science fiction, is I don't fear computers, I fear the lack of them. I think they kind of accelerate our ability to be humans better than humans. They make decisions for us every day that we typically don't have to make. They provide safer environments, safer driving in cars, all these benefits that we get from these computer environments. There's downsides as well. We kind of have to be careful with that. But to me, just focusing on this technology that can better our lives is really fascinating to me, and it still is to this day. I'm always fascinated with what we can do with computers. Certainly moving into AI, and one of my first jobs out of college was an AI analyst. Being able to leverage this amazing technology to remove some of the mundane tasks out of our lives. And there's a bunch of stuff that's there. And we all carry computers within our phones and our tablet systems in our cars, things like that. And the ability to better those things to make them provide more value back to businesses and back to humans just really kind of seemed to be my focus from the start.
And what excites you, like jumping 35 years? What excites you about the cloud in 2023?
Yeah, I first got into cloud in the late 90s. I was CTO of Software AG, and I kind of realized that this internet thing is interesting. And not only is it's basically a place where we can find information. So HTML and all of those World Wide Web stuff started to emerge. And we had application delivery networks then, which are early versions of software as a service or SaaS. And I said, well, why can't we do the same thing for things that we typically have in the data center? Storage integration. And I actually worked for an integration company at the time, data integration. So why couldn't we deliver this thing as a service over the open internet? This is probably 1997, 1998. And I think, it wasn't a unique idea. People had, we had time sharing services, which were, kind of early days in terms of cloud, different kind of delivery model and limitations on what you're able to do. So let's take these things that are very expensive, setting up a data center, setting up storage systems and compute systems to get a company underway. And a startup then would have to pay at least $1 million to get all those equipments in a data center and localized for the data center. And let's push that out to some sort of a time sharing model again, where we're able to share storage services between many different companies and compute services within many different companies. And through economies of scale, we should be able to do a few things. Number one, reduce the cost that we have to pass down to those companies that are leveraging it, which cloud computing does, because it's a multi-tenant environment. Lots of different tenants are leveraging the same physical hardware. And also, number two, it becomes more sustainable in reducing some of the power. And of course, sustainability wasn't on anybody's radar screen back then. But I realized moving forward that the amount of water and power that these data centers consume was not necessarily a good thing. So our ability to share these systems and reduce cost and provide just kind of a better, more efficient architecture was a step in the right direction. And so wrote a paper called Project Archangel, which was really about taking data integration, because that's what I was doing at the time, putting it as a service, very much like Boomi does today, and leveraging it instead of a individual server that we have to install in everybody's data center, but the ability to kind of do integration within the intra-company and intra-company, supporting B2B integration, things like that. And it absolutely went nowhere. No one was interested in it, couldn't get it funded. And I think I turned that into an IEEE article or something like that. And then actually ended up working for a company called Grand Central, which was an integration as a service company that started in the 90s and since now it's gone away. But the idea was the same, the ability to share infrastructure. With the train analogy, you can see the ability to share infrastructure, the ability to share very expensive data integration technology among lots of different companies and have lots of different benefits in terms of the cost you're able to reduce, the cost savings you bring back to the company. That was during, and also that was SaaS integration, software as a service. And then we started to get into the rise of the cloud, which was what I've been writing and speaking about for years, the ability to kind of leverage common resources found in a data center, compute, storage, AI engines, things like that, but doing it as a service where we don't have to own hardware and software. And that started to emerge as a concept that people were interested in, but not necessarily deploying. In fact, there was a lot of conversations I used to have back in 2003, 2004, where they just thought it was an awful idea. They thought it was security was going to be an issue, performance was going to be an issue. And couldn't be overcome. And the reality is it could. And so a few years later, AWS, showed up on the scene and had an infrastructure as a service provider, which was basically reselling some of their infrastructure that they didn't need off season. And that kind of emerged into the infrastructure as a service play. And then bringing that up into what cloud computing is today, kind of started in 2007 in terms of interest. 2009, NIST wrote the definition of cloud computing: infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, software as a service, and also hybrid cloud, community cloud, private clouds, as concepts. And then kind of the industry aligned behind those concepts and kind of watch it emerge since then. Also watch people's attitude changes. So people who would probably, not even take my call back in, 2006, when I talked about sharing infrastructure, were very much interested in it in 2009, 2010, when it started to inflect as a concept that many companies were viewing as a good evolution of the technology. And so that was a satisfying thing, because I got to be part of an industry at its infancy from the idea stage into building it into something that it is today, which is depends on the organization that you work for. I mean, 30 to 50% of infrastructure operates on SaaS-based systems, infrastructure as service-based systems, things like that. And cloud's becoming more secure than on-premise, kind of crossed that threshold a few years ago. Provides better performance, and if you manage it correctly, it can provide better cost efficiency. Again, if you manage it correctly.
If you manage it correctly,
right?
Yeah.
So we're getting.
Would you say a lot of clients manage it incorrectly, or?
Yeah, well, if you look at the survey, some of the ones I published on my InfoWorld blog, they do. So in other words, there are a lot of ROI issues getting back from cloud, and they see cloud as being more expensive than they initially thought. It's not returning the ROI back to the business that they initially thought. When I looked into those, most of those are self-inflicted wounds. So in other words, they're just not doing the things and taking the steps they need to govern costs. Having FinOps programs, they typically don't have them. They're letting instances flounder out there, and basically the meter's on when that happens. They were spinning resources up and committing to the resources. We have to pay for them while they're operating, and that's how the cloud providers charge. And so there seems to be two, different levels of use out there. People who are very diligent about managing these resources, both allocating and running and operating them in a very cost efficient way. And organizations that are, quite frankly, they were new to cloud and they didn't really understand the downsides and the economics of not necessarily putting governance and putting discipline and accountability behind leveraging these resources. And so I've been focused on that for the last couple of years. I actually did a FinOps course, talk about those capabilities. And so if they're able to get those disciplines in place and able to get the people trained up, that's a solvable problem. But right now I see companies all over the place and just kind of making huge mistakes. That doesn't mean it's not always going to be their fault. They could have migrated things out there that weren't good applications to run in the cloud. May not have understood the cloud capabilities as well as they should. But we kind of have to work together as public cloud providers and consultants and end users, organizations, to figure out a better way to use this technology more efficiently, because we don't have a choice. All the innovation and investment has gone into the cloud. It hasn't gone back into the on-premise systems. So they're not giving you an option in many instances to move back on-premise with some instances. But the technology there ultimately is going to be investing in cloud-based resources.
Would you say that the fact that it's very expensive for a few companies out there that might have an issue with discipline or with education, couldn't it also be due to the fact that the companies that advertise for the clouds and that strive to the clouds, that they often have like way bigger problems when and way more scaling problems than the typical like, let's say, digital native company that is just moving over, and that like lots of stuff that is advertised there is kind of highly over engineering for like the companies that actually strive for it.
You mean the public cloud providers spinning cloud in such a way where the end users don't necessarily understand the risks?
Yeah, that and that, like, Google's problem is not everyone's problem, right?
Yeah, I mean, obviously they're a technology provider, and we've always had hyperbole that goes along with using technology, and sometimes a misunderstanding in how the technology should be used. And I don't view any technology provider out there as being off the hook and doing that. And I think that the misunderstandings typically occur in the corporate side because people have a tendency to chase technology trends, and cloud computing was certainly a technology trend, and therefore didn't bother to understand. And probably to your point, it should have been an open conversation with what workloads should move to the cloud, why they should move to the cloud, how you monitor them, how you manage them in the cloud. Those discussions typically weren't had until about 3 years ago. And so people started hitting these expense walls and moving forward. And I think part of that, to your point, is just going to be misunderstanding in the industry in terms of kind of overhyping the technology. And the thing is, it was, even the pundits in the industry, the conferences that I was speaking at, things like that, everything was pretty much go gung-ho cloud. In other words, we're going to promote this kind of model as always going to be the answer to solve lots of your different problems, when that's never going to be the case. There's no technology out there that should always be used. And the reality is that not every application that sits in a data center, a data set that sits in a data center, should exist on the cloud from an economic perspective. So it's just getting to asking these tough questions that, quite frankly, were not asked, I think, back in 2009 through 2005. 2009 through 2015, when that whole industry was exploding, because there was never any downsides brought up. And I found that if I brought up downsides, they typically were ignored. And looking
Mm.
at this from an architectural perspective and not making mistakes, I think we're in such a growth hype of the cloud, and the industry out there, including the pundits and the tech press and the companies themselves, kind of viewed it as we cannot say can do no wrong and has no downside. And therefore, to your point, didn't ask the tougher questions that need to be answered.
Yeah, like I think like if we're also like very often talking about trends in the cloud, and then lots of people feel attracted by the idea of let's for example pick MultiCloud, right? Like I mean, who needs MultiCloud realistically these days? Like percentage of customers you see and you work with, like who really needs it?
It's anybody that needs to leverage best of breed technology. And so it depends on what they're doing. So the depend answer again you get from a consultant. So in other words, if I'm leveraging cloud computing and I'm leveraging a single public cloud provider and I'm trying to pick the best AI engine for my particular application, either I can go with what that single cloud provider provides or look out to the other, two major cloud providers or 7 major cloud providers if you get to the second tier cloud providers, and who has the best of breed AI engine that they're able to leverage. And that's kind of how multi-cloud happens. And the thing is, there's a cost in moving to multi-cloud because your trade-off is heterogeneity and complexity. It has to be operated, it has to be maintained. You have to keep skill sets around to maintain the cloud. But the reality is that if you're able to get to a much more efficient and much more innovative solution, based on you using another cloud provider versus the one you're currently using 2, 3, sometimes 4 cloud providers, that's typically going to be cost justifiable if that best of breed technology is able to bring much more innovation and efficiency to the particular solution. To your point, being devil's advocate for myself, that does not mean that to not look at the trade-offs in doing that. There's additional costs, additional complexity, operational issues, things like that, to a point that many of the CIOs right now, since they're running into this complexity wall with multi-cloud, are saying, we're not going to move to any more clouds. And so we're just going to use one particular cloud provider and that's it. You can't find what you need in that cloud provider. Tough. But those are not necessarily optional things. If people are able to need technology to take their solutions, to take their innovations to the next level. And that's why more of the innovative companies out there leverage multi-cloud, because they align the particular solutions with the best of breed technology. You just have other problems you need to solve. You have cost complexity, how you manage those systems, how you operationalize those systems, deal with heterogeneity, things like that, which are solvable problems. But you're going to have to understand the trade-offs. You're going to leverage these services to get to a multi-cloud state. You're also going to have to solve these 3 other problems that can really kill you if they're not paid attention to.
Yeah, and I think like many companies still not being in the cloud and now moving, let's say typical lift and shift cases, underestimate the complexity of the cloud first and go for like way too big setups for them, and pick like a multi-cloud setup, even if they, I don't know, never ran something apart from like a virtual machine somewhere, and didn't make the move. So isn't it like an evolutionary process of moving to the cloud, and something you need to be very patient with, and you need to maybe first pick like a small setup, or a smaller setup than lots of companies go for?
Yeah, I always like the baby steps way of doing something. If you're certainly a normal core company, you don't have super great skill sets around. You just have average people that are trained in IT and they're just trying to keep things running. Then you can be overly aggressive and get over your skis in terms of your ability to deploy and leverage this technology correctly to an efficient way. So my advice is, many smaller battles win the war. And typically when people take a big bang approach to cloud computing or any technology deployment for that level, they can get in trouble quick because it's too much, too fast with too few resources and too few skill sets. Cloud's no different.
What are the trends you right now see? Like, is it still like the hybrid setups, the multi-clouds, or like what do people care about in 23?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it's a boring answer. I think to the point we just said at the beginning of the conversation, it's optimization. Your ability to leverage assets in the cloud in a more optimized way that's going to return more value, more ROI back to the business. I hear that as the most common question. So, whether it's optimizing a multi-cloud setup or a hybrid cloud setup or a single cloud setup, it doesn't seem to matter. They're just focusing on taking what they already have deployed and going back and refactoring applications to make them more effective and efficient, going back and implementing a FinOps program, going back, implementing governance, going back and implementing operational technology like AI ops to better control their environment. So they're not as focused on expansion anymore. They're focused on leveraging what they have already in the cloud and optimizing those systems. And by the way, in some instances, that's going to mean this thing should have never been in the cloud. That mistake was made 5 years ago. Let's move it back on premise. And I'm saying repatriation is a question that's coming up a lot. And I think it's the right question to answer. That doesn't mean you failed at cloud. That just means you move some workloads out onto a public cloud provider that shouldn't be there. And they're much more cost effective in running back on premise, either a colo or a managed service provider on your own private data center, than they do in existing in the cloud. And there's always a reason for doing that.
And in many cases, that's the case, right? If you just look at like non-cloud providers and what they charge, then in many cases it's way cheaper. Would you say that if you just look at that, you're missing something?
Just look at cloud?
No, just look at the cheaper data centers that and on-prem.
Yeah,
is it like a
it's
a TCO question, obviously, right?
Yeah, and absolutely. It comes back into where that workload should actually run. And so if you're just coming back to the data center because you view storage as being way cheaper in the data center now, and it absolutely is, it's dropped like a rock in the last 10 years, then you're missing the larger issue. Is there a reason other than cost and storage capabilities that you need to have this workload in the cloud? Access to cloud native systems like AI and analytics and big data systems, things like that, integration with other systems exist on the cloud. All these questions need to be asked. And that doesn't mean that you're not going to have a reason to repatriate some of these things or leave them in the data center for the reasons you just cited. But these are holistic, very complex architectural questions that have to be dealt with. And they have to be asked on each and every workload and each and every data set as to where the thing should be run. And also looking at the future of the technology. In other words, there may be a short-term savings gain in pushing it back on premise, but maybe a long-term risk associated with our inability to take advantage of some of the cloud features. And also, if the cloud prices drop, then that may not have been a bad, that may have been a worse choice than you think it is. So you get into these multiple complex systems that people need to think about. But one thing it is, it's never binary. In other words, this is cheaper here, I move here. This is more expensive here, I don't move here. Lots of other attributes need to be considered.
I don't know if you saw the article of David Heinemeier Hansen and Basecamp moving away from the cloud again and going on-prem again. Did you see that?
No, but I see those all the time. People bring them to my attention. I didn't read that article specifically.
Okay. Do you see cloud prices really dropping in the next years? I mean, there's some competition going on, right? And I still miss really the big jumps in prices and really savings being realized more quickly. Do you see that coming in the next years?
Yeah, I think that cloud prices, public cloud provider prices, are going to drop for some services, not all services. And the reason is competition pressure and repricing systems kind of based on their own costs. And so if physical HDDs, hard drive disk storage for on-premise system has dropped a lot in the last 10 years, and that becomes a more attractive option for people that are currently in the cloud, they're going to want to maintain those people in the cloud, and therefore they're going to drop their prices as well. But it typically won't be for everything. It's going to be for certain services and certain aspects of services. The cloud is going to price their stuff very much like the airlines price flights. It's very expensive to get a flight now, and all the planes are full. But during the pandemic, it was very cheap, and you were probably on a 20% full flight. So if the market shifts them, they're going to adjust to the market, just like every other player out there. They're obviously operating in their own best interest, but they also understand the market conditions as well. They know you can go to another cloud provider. They know you can bring your stuff back on premise. And so that's where the pressure is going to occur. So to answer your question, yeah, they're probably going to drop as things get less expensive and they become better at doing it. They'll pass those savings down to the customer just to try to maintain those customers. And also, in many instances, people will negotiate these large enterprise deals where they're going to provide very preferred pricing to large companies. So just to make sure that they, don't have a compelling reason to move back on premise, but to keep their workloads in the cloud.
You see a lot of setups, and lots of people ask you for your help in optimizing cloud cost. What is the biggest leverage typically? Like, what are the biggest levers to pull?
I think the biggest lever to pull is basically resource optimization, just putting things away when you're done with them. That's where the mistakes are being made. People are getting these large bills. Almost everyone that I look into, they've spun up a petabyte of storage and then needed it for an hour to process, do an end-of-year processing thing, and just left it up and running. And so your ability to kind of find those things and shut them down, and also have accountability down to the workload, the application, the time, and the user who's moving into makes a huge deal. That's the lowest hanging fruit. Like I said, most of the cost overruns that are there are, are self-inflicted wounds, and we're just going to see more of that until they put some efficiency around it. So that's why FinOps is such an important concept now. It basically financial discipline around leveraging an IT resource, in this case, the cloud. That comes with lots of cool tools. We can monitor, we can put away, we can optimize, we can, tweak, that we couldn't just a few years ago because the tools are better. But at the end of the day, it doesn't really take a genius to know that if you, spin up something, you're going to have to spin it down or else it's going to end up costing you money. It's very much like in a house. If we start turning on every light and never turn it off and wonder why our bill's so high, or turn on every appliance and never turn them off and wonder why our bill's so high. Same thing's kind of occurring in the corporate world when it comes to cloud cost overruns. And then you can get into some tuning stuff, optimization, the ability to kind of go back and renegotiate your enterprise deal with your clients and things like that. Those aren't going to be as helpful as just solving the problems of putting discipline around using the cloud resources.
So turn off light, my friend. And do you have like a valid strategy of implementing that discipline? I mean, is it just cost discipline? Is it just transparency on costs? Or like where do you start typically, or where could companies start these days?
I think the first place you start is figuring out what your costs truly are and what's causing the costs. You don't have no visibility into that. People talk about financial FinOps observability, your ability to kind of understand trends and stuff. I just, in many instances, just looking at a sheet of paper, just seeing where the costs and where the money is actually going and have visibility into that. If you asked cloud consumers and CIOs, 9 times out of 10, they're not going to be able to tell you, because they just get the big bill at the end of the month. They pay it, don't really understand where the bill's coming from. They know it's being consumed by people in their organization, and they just go ahead and pay it without asking the question. So having visibility and transparency into what those things are, the line item details and what you're spending, is going to be the first step in doing that. I don't even think you need fancy tools to do that. You can look at your, dashboard, cost billing dashboard at the end of the month and figure out where this stuff is costing. And that seems rudimentary, but not a lot of people are doing it because they moved in the cloud rather quickly, didn't really care much about the cost. They just knew they had to move to cloud, and they're going to use cloud as efficiently as they could. They heard 10 years ago that cloud is going to be more cost efficient and cheaper, and therefore that's going to be the case for them. It has not been because of the inefficiencies kind of built in their system. Even some of the inefficiencies built in the public cloud providers. And then you can play the game with the observability and the trending and cost predicting and budgetary stuff, and putting governance around systems so people aren't allowed to run away with cloud spending if you're a particular user. And those are all things you do after the fact, after you figure out where the major problems are. And I think that's where we are today, even though people would tell you that they're monitoring their cloud costs and being very diligent in making these happen. And the majority of instances where they're having cost overruns and lack of ROI coming back to the business, you can almost trace it into discipline issues around the accountability.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely makes sense. What I also often see is that companies absolutely lose in complexity, right? I mean, spinning up instances, spinning them down again is like a simple form, but so many companies have so many services that they lose oversight, and they don't know where they can actually like shut down stuff again after a while, because they don't know how services play together and which service is actually used and which isn't. Is that also something you see a lot?
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. I mean, when you get into it, we're also getting into trouble with the complexity issue, certainly in multi-cloud and hybrid cloud deployments. Your ability to monitor and understand these costs and how they exist one to another. You think about it in a multi-cloud deployment, you have, say, 2 or 3 different cloud providers, all at different price point levels, and they all have different terms, and they all bill differently. And so how do you keep track of that? And so you have to use the tools to remove the complexity from you, to abstract you from dealing with these back-end billing systems and accountability systems. And that's the only way you can do it. But first, you kind of have to understand what it is and the problem that you're solving before you pick a solution. And that's kind of the hard part. So complexity is getting into a challenge, into operational complexity, and we have to pay more to operate those systems, keep different skill sets around to keep them going. And they're way harder to track cost. And certainly if you have systems that are even interdependent, where you have some stuff running on Google and other stuff running on AWS, and then if they're dependent one to another, how do you track costs there and build them back? And it's a problem that is solvable, but it's quite frankly a harder problem to solve than just buying hardware and sticking it in your data center. That was pretty simple. So we're getting back to a very complex array of things, and it's the billing cycles and the terms are not getting less complex, they're getting more complex. And people, quite frankly, are just kind of running into what I call a complexity wall. In other words, they're paying too much. There's reduced value that's coming back from the cloud based on the amount of complexity that they're creating in building all these services willy-nilly and migrating these applications. And that's the downside of what we just pointed to and leveraging multi-cloud. We're leveraging best of breed, and we get some value for that. But the complexity comes back as a value remover from enterprises because they're not going to be able to keep track of everything.
So does that mean that everything comes in waves, and there will be like a wave towards simplicity again?
Well, I think simplicity has gone out the window, to be honest with you. And I think that best of breed is typically going to have the best value that we're moving in, but you can mitigate complexity through complexity mediation systems. I have another LinkedIn Learning video on cloud complexity management, just kind of getting to that. I think it's 3 hours long, but getting into the fact that we have to understand how complex our environment is and what the different domains are, start to place them into particular buckets, and then abstract them with tooling so we can manage this complexity as a very simple environment. So to your point, which I think is spot on, we have to make complex things simple for the human beings to manage it, also manage it with automation and abstraction. So we're no longer trying to deal with complexity on complexity's terms. That's never going to scale. In that, another option is, like I said, is to say we can't handle this complex environment. We know we have 2 clouds here. We're going to 3. We're going to 1. So everything has to be combined to a single provider, where we're using one set of dashboards to deal with billing and monitoring and things like that. The downside is you're going to end up going to multi-cloud at some point in time in the future as people see the need to do it. So you might as well get good at it moving forward. And the good news is we have lots of tools that will allow us to manage complexity well. Observability tools, AI ops, and FinOps tools to manage cost complexity, governance, SecOps tools to manage security complexity, lots of things that are there to make it happen. It's just very difficult to set these things up. There's not a lot of people out there that have the knowledge to allow you to do that successfully, not a lot of procedures. you look at the rise of the concept of MetaCloud and SuperCloud, they just had a conference at the Cube about that. That's really getting into complexity mediation. So if you look at what a SuperCloud is, it's a layer of technology that logically runs above the public cloud providers. It's about removing the redundancy out of the public cloud providers. In other words, different security systems, different monitoring and management systems, different FinOps systems, things like that, and centralize them at a layer that runs above the cloud providers. It may physically run within a cloud provider, but from a logical point of view, we're dealing with a single security layer, a single operations layer, a single governance layer, a single FinOps layer. And that's the only way you solve complexity. And I think the sooner people start architecting to that and investing in that, the better off they're going to be. Because guess what? You can add your hybrid clouds in there. It's your public clouds, your private clouds, your enterprise systems, your edge-based system. It can all run under this common framework. And so now we have the tools available. They weren't there 5 years ago, but they are now to make these things successful. So people are starting to build those things out in kind of rudimentary ways.
So it's essentially decoupling the cloud again.
And it's architectural tricks to make things simple by removing redundancy, by not necessarily removing redundancy. We still have 3 different security layers there that we're managing, but we're abstracting them into a single security manager and SecOps tools that allows us to automate and make these very complex things simple. It's about dealing with our limitations as human beings. We don't deal with complex things very well. We can automate things that are complex, like when driving our car. We have lots of different systems that deals with the fuel system, the steering system, the HVAC system, all those things on our behalf. But if we had to turn those things on and off and do lots of switches, like we did in the old days with old cars, no one ever want to drive. It's too complicated of a process. And so this is about removing complexity and dealing with complexity on our terms versus complexity's terms.
But sometimes you can reduce complexity to also just not follow every trend, right? Microservices versus monoliths, for example. Many companies out there just have a monolith and live with it, and choose that path, knowing the complexity of microservices. Would you say that this is also something that will happen in the cloud world?
Yeah, I hope. There should be no reason why we move toward technology just because it's in a hype state. And certainly containers and microservices and container orchestration and all these things that are more related to the cloud native architecture trends that are going on are the preferred way to do it. But the reality is there needs to be a reason to use them. So you're going to make applications that are going to be much more complicated to operate if you're moving in this area. There may be a compelling reason why you want to do that. And I'm always looking for those compelling reasons, but you need to understand the compelling reason first, versus just picking technology because of hyperbole. And we have a tendency to do that in the technology world. The way I look at it, it's almost like a child's soccer game where we kick the ball over in one side of the field and everybody runs over. There's no strategy to it. Goes to the other side of the field, everybody runs over again. And in my career, I saw lots of this stuff move on. It was mainframes and then the rise of the PC and then the rise of client server and LAN computing and the rise of service-oriented architecture, distributed objects. I saw all these things kind of emerge. And then certainly the rise of cloud around that occurred out of all this and the rise of integration. So just because something is used by lots of people and has some value in some instances where it's being used, it doesn't mean that you should use it. And I always say, take the most optimized way to do that and leave complexity out of the mix as much as you can. And that's an architectural trend. Because I think we're going to end up with lots of these enterprise applications, enterprise systems that are going to be way under optimized. And you get the whole, thing. Well, it works. Of course it works, but it's costing you 10 times the money to run and operate these systems, versus something that's simpler. I get it. You get to use containers and microservices and container orchestration, but that tripled your development costs, and it's going to make your operational costs 10 times as much. So why do you want to do that? Well, it's microservices and containers. That's never going to be a reason for me. I'm a hype guy too. I have speak about current technology trends and where things are going. I have to stay ahead of the game and explain things in the firm and outside of the firm, as to what the technology means. But in an architectural situation, I'm never going to sell technology first. I'm going to sell the solution and the business value and the business optimization of the solution. I know that sounds like a boring way to look at it, but that's the only way that's going to work if you're going to make this technology viable for the business. Now, I mean, a big concern now is people are using tech. The stuff always works; it never fails. With enough time and money, I can make anything work. But it's the efficiency of it is going to kill companies. I think companies are going to end up getting in trouble because they haven't optimized their utilization of technology where other people have, and they're not getting the value out of it that they should. And that's going to end up killing the companies. I think a lot of bigger companies are going to fall by the wayside, not because their product or services failed, but their IT solutions, their innovation technology, the customer experience that they're able to provide is going to be way under optimized based on what the competitors are doing.
Yeah, I think like many companies are just operating at a too high cost, right?
Yeah.
Also,
Yeah.
if you look at the VC world and how cheap money was, now it's not as cheap as it was, and you see many companies taking venture debt and failing, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And they're failing for preventable reasons. I mean, the market is a good reason to fail. If the market's not there, people aren't able to buy your product. And sometimes we can't help where the market's going to go and demand for a product's going to go, but we can deal with our efficiency and our ability to leverage technology and as an innovative force multiplier. And that's what startups, really need to focus on. If you look at the Ubers of the world and the Airbnbs of the world and Netflix of the world, people, the poster, they're always the examples that people love to use for, people innovating with technology. Well, same thing's going to come to the pharmaceutical world and the manufacturing world and the automobile world's already coming to that, where those companies are able to leverage technology as a true innovative force multiplier and do things much more efficiently at the same time, like automating a smart supply chain, things like that, are the ones that are going to win the game, because it's becoming not a lot of difference with one company versus another that offers a particular service. And, everybody's building cars now. They're all good, pretty much. And then it becomes down to the customer experience and your ability to automate systems in the car and your ability to provide a better customer relationship than your competitor, and also build a better car. And the same thing can be said about pharmaceuticals and manufacturing and agriculture. It's just coming down to the fact that people who are able to they're becoming technology companies unto themselves. So people who are able to leverage technology more effectively are the ones that are going to win the game. I don't care if you're selling corn or electric vehicles. And so people are realizing that right now. And they're going into technology as an investment versus an expense. 10 years ago, 20 years ago, I was an expense. I was the guy doing the development. They had to keep me around to automate some of the business systems that they needed to automate. But the reality is I moved money off the bottom line because they just looked at me as something that was necessary to make things go. And innovation and product development was occurring in another domain. Now innovation and product development is occurring within the technology stack for any given industry. And your ability to kind of leverage that more effectively and efficiently is going to be your key differentiator, because everybody kind of figures out how to do the commodity stuff well, how to, sell drugs and build cars and plant corn and, all the things we just discussed about. So that's what people need to be focusing on right now.
Okay, thanks a lot. We shortly have to come to the end. And one question I really wanted to ask you is the top 3 common mistakes you see very often in grown setups, and how you would advise CTOs to avoid them.
You mean in cloud setups?
In cloud setups, yes.
Yeah. Well, number one, not understanding their own business requirements. That's the huge mistake. They're not assessing their existing as-is state in terms of their systems and their people and their skill sets and the culture. And if you miss those, you're unable to put those on a path to change, then nothing else is going to work. If I implement cloud technology and the company is not accepting cloud technology or not accepting that they're going to have to change skill sets to leverage this technology effectively, they're going to fail. And that's a hard problem to solve. I understand why people are not paying attention. That's a huge mistake, but it's the biggest mistake that I see. Number 2 would be not dealing, to the point you brought up, that I think was spot on, not dealing with efficiency, but looking at hyperbole in terms of what's cool and what technologies are there. So I walk into a few, situations where the client goes, "Well, this is our AWS project, or this is our Google project, this is a Microsoft project." Well, why are we saying that at this point? We don't understand the existing systems. Well, we heard that's the best way to go. Any public cloud provider, and our cloud native stuff now, I think that's what I hear the most. When there's a reason to use it, but there's reasons not to use it. And I find there's lots more reasons not to use it than a reason to use it. And so it's not having that conversation, ending up moving to technology for technology's sake. And that's a huge issue, I think, unto itself. Number three would be failing to hire the skills you need, which really kind of goes back to most of the problems that we're dealing with. So if I'm able to find the technologists that are able to bring some innovative change to my business, and I'm able to maintain that talent within my company, you have no chance of moving forward with your technology. You can certainly hire consultants, and I think that's going to be fine. But eventually, if good consultants are in there to cease being needed, because if they do their job, then they're moving on to other things. And after building, and they're training people on how to do it, and leaving some value there and moving forward and allowing them to take off of the value. But if you don't have the skill sets in place in the culture and a path to get there, and certainly that's a huge issue now, it's just never going to work.
Thank you. I still have a little surprise for you, and it's my favorite question. So I was once talking to the CTO of Amazon, Werner Vogels, and he told me about a secret Easter egg we know about, called Time Machine in the AWS CLI. And this feature does exactly what the name advertises. So it lets you travel back in time. And we now have the chance. So I have my laptop here and my console running that Easter egg. And we now have the chance to travel back in time to the year 20,000 when you started to work for IBM. And we can observe you for a while coding, doing like a few management tasks as well. And we observed yourself for a while, and now you have the chance to whisper something into young David's ears. What would it be?
Invest in cloud.
That's good. So actually buy Amazon stock.
Buy everybody's stock. Anybody that has yeah. I mean, I have an independence thing, so I can't go out there and buy everybody's stock. That has to be controlled and reported. But investing in that technology, I think, would have been a good idea. Everybody who logged onto it became a bigger company and created more value in the space. Not everybody, but I think if you made investments in stock and went to work for cloud companies, things like that, it probably would have been a good use of your time and money.
And did anyone whisper that into young David's ears?
Yeah, well, I knew it was going to be big, but I was in 2000. I was working for Mercator, by the way, that ended up getting bought by IBM. Ended up being something that was kind of disappointing at the time because I wasn't getting a lot of positive feedback. People were telling me I was crazy. Not everybody. I had a few partners in crime. Some of them worked with me at Deloitte, but for the most part, I heard that's never going to happen. Go focus on something else. When I truly believed that model was going to be something that was going to be a much better way, more efficient way to consume technology.
And then our follow-up question, what is the equivalent in this year? Is it blockchain or AI still, or?
I think ultimately it's pretty easy to look at the trends in technology. Everything's going to be moving to AI more, even though we've been dealing with AI since the 50s. And always people think it's new technology. It's not. It was conceptually derived at Dartmouth in the 50s. And I leveraged it when I was 21 and just out of college. I was doing Lisp programming and teaching it at the local community college as well. But it's kind of coming into its own in terms of its ability. Cloud is making it more commoditized, easier to use, less expensive. And look at something like GPT, and some amazing stuff that come out of it. It's really kind of taking that whole thing to the next level. So I would say focus on the integration of AI-based systems. So you can take lots of different AI systems and make them 1 + 1 = 3 kind of scenarios. And then focus on the optimization areas of cloud computing. So that's observability, AI ops, FinOps. I think that's going to be, we're still going to do migration. We're still going to do, cloud native development, but I think much of the focus is going to be, if we're going to do this, we need to get the optimization, how we operationalize these systems under control. That's where I would invest now.
Cool. Thanks a lot, David.
Anytime.
have to look at my portfolio later on. So thanks a lot for the podcast. It was really fun talking to you, and I'm really looking forward to your book. When is it coming out?
It's going to come out in April. Just a few months. I just sent back the PDFs after checking them. That's Insider's Guide to Cloud Computing. You can find it on Amazon now in pre-order. But I think it's a good book. I'm trying to make sure I enlighten people on everything that's going on in the cloud computing space, much like the conversation we just had here, so people can make the most informed decisions.
Thanks a lot.
You got
Thanks a lot. Gonna pre-order now. Have a good day.
You too.
Thank you for listening to the AlphaList podcast. If you like this episode, share it with friends. I'm sure they love it too. Make sure to subscribe so you can hear deep insights into technical leadership and technology trends as they become available. Also, please tell us if there is a topic you would like to hear more about or a technical leader whose brain you would like us to pick. AlphaList is all about helping CTOs getting access to the insights they need to make the best decisions for their company. Please send us suggestions to cto@alphalist.com. Send me a message on LinkedIn or Twitter. After all, the more knowledge we bring to CTOs, the more growth we see in tech. Or, as we say on AlphaList, accumulated knowledge to accelerate growth. See you in the next episode.